The Beekeeper's Son. The Spite Lane Hauntings, Book 2. By Christiane Erwin. Read by Jenn Lee. Prologue. Tyler Timberlake pressed his nose to the glass as the SUV rolled through Spite Lane's entry gates. Trees covered the entrance, obscuring the sky. The gates were broken and surrounded by thorny weeds. To the side of the unpaved road, Tyler spotted a discarded bike rusting out, the front wheel missing. This place was creepy. His discomfort made him more wiggly than ever. "Tyler, stop kicking my seat." His father, Ren Timberlake, grumbled from the front of the car. Molly Mapplethorpe, the quirky real estate lady, drove. His father sat in the passenger seat. Miss Mapplethorpe had been babbling a mile a minute, going on and on about what a wonderful place this was to raise a child. It was quiet and secluded, she explained. No through traffic, and the homes were oversized with plenty of room to run around. "There had better be room for running," Ren said, and Tyler knew what that meant. "Go run around outside," was one of his father's favorite phrases. The tall pines that loomed over the entrance parted as soon as they were through, revealing an open expanse of land shaped into rolling mounds, with strange-looking houses sitting atop them. The street wound between the houses, back and forth. Tyler stopped agitating momentarily as the car passed a dilapidated home with a broken concrete sidewalk, sagging front porch, and boarded-up windows. He could have sworn he saw someone peeking out behind a broken pane of glass. He squinted, but a glint of sunlight prevented him from seeing anything as they drove away. Tyler wasn't sure he wanted to live in this neighborhood, no matter how much room there was for running. "You said this one has a motivated seller?" Ren asked. "Oh, yes, indeed," replied Molly, whose name was on the for sale signs in what seemed like half of Spite Lane's yards. "I'm sure they would consider any reasonable offer." The SUV pulled into a gravel driveway that sloped sharply upwards toward a Victorian home that had been painted dark brown with Kelly green trim. The windows were tall and skinny, and the glass in them was wobbly. But at least none of them were boarded up. Tyler supposed it was better than their last house, a tiny cabin in the northern woods where he'd practically frozen to death in the winter. Lost Key, Florida, was warm all year, his father promised. No snow, and just a couple of miles from the beach where he could swim around all day. Tyler hopped out of the car as soon as it was parked, following his dad and Molly Mapplethorpe up the wide, creaking porch steps and through the front door. The inside of the house was quiet and musty, filled with furniture draped with dust-covered sheets. "It comes furnished?" Ren asked, as he stopped next to the staircase, one hand resting on the thick wooden balustrade. "Oh, yes. That's common around here," Molly answered. "Probably a second property, you know, a snowbird who only visited in winter." "Is that a problem? Do you have a lot of things?" They didn't. The cabin had been tiny, and much of their furniture had been in disrepair. Ren had said they could buy new furniture when they settled down in Lost Key. He could see the stifled excitement on his father's face. Free stuff. Tyler's dad loved free stuff. "Not a problem at all," said Ren, pleased. The adults walked from room to room, looking inside closets and under sinks, turning faucets and light switches on and off as they went. Tyler lagged behind. He wandered around the first floor, passing the staircase as the adults climbed it. It sat in the center of the house, such that the living areas, dining room, and kitchen formed a circle that could be run round and round. Tyler, always full of energy, jogged a couple of laps. Bored, he began doing the thing his father hated most: touching things. Tyler ran his fingers through the dust on the countertops. He peeked under the sheets at the stuffy old furniture and poked their lumpy cushions. He dragged his heels against the squeaky wooden floors and pressed himself against the walls. The windows stretched up to almost meet the 10-foot ceilings and were adorned with long, velvety curtains that rested on the floor. Tyler yanked at a curtain, wrapped himself up behind it, and imagined startling the strange real estate lady when she came back downstairs. With his nose pressed against it, Tyler sniffed at the fabric's distinct aroma. It was sickly sweet, like sticking his whole face in a bucket of grape Kool-Aid powder, and the smell made Tyler slightly nauseous. He turned away to face the window. Looking outside, he saw the backyard. It sloped down towards 2 other houses and was peppered with strange wooden boxes that sat askew. Tyler wondered what was inside them. Absent-mindedly, he placed his hands on the windowsill to steady himself, but he flinched when his fingers touched something small and crunchy, like dried cereal. He pulled his hands away and looked down. Bugs. Piles of dead bugs sat on the painted windowsill. He was grossed out, but also curious. Bending over to take a better look, he realized they were bees with their characteristic yellow and black striping. Their crispy little wings fluttered as his breath swept over them. They were dried out, dead, had to be. And yet, Tyler swore he could hear a faint buzzing sound. He was about to turn his ear to them, getting as close as he could, when the curtain whipped open. "Tyler, I've told you 1,000 times, don't touch things that aren't yours." Wren scowled at him in exasperation. From across the house, Molly Mapplethorpe called, "Are you ready to see the backyard?" Tyler took that as his cue and bolted like a champion sprinter across the house. Molly Mapplethorpe had said there was lots of room to run around outside, and she wasn't kidding. As soon as Tyler made it out the back door, he leapt off the back steps. His feet slammed against the packed dirt path, and he ran a labyrinth course through the yard. The warm November sun was unfamiliar to him, but welcome. He had hated being cooped up for months at a time up north. Wren inspected the exterior of the home as Tyler ran in circles. He was a jet, flying through the air. He was a bird of prey, squawking and hunting for his dinner. He was a plane. Vroom! He was... Tyler stopped in front of one of the strange wooden boxes that sat on top of a couple of sinking cinder blocks in the middle of the backyard. It looked like it had been fashioned out of whatever scraps of wood had been lying around. It had no obvious openings. Tyler ran his hands over it, trying to figure out how to pop the lid. It was stuck. Tyler squeezed his fingers into a small crack and tried to pry it open. But there was a sticky substance holding it together. The more he handled it, the more his hands were covered in goo. Behind him, he heard the adults approach. "Beekeeping," the agent was saying. "Isn't that just the sweetest thing ever?" No pun intended. "So, these are hives?" Wren asked. He put a meaty hand on Tyler's shoulder and gave it an uncomfortable squeeze. "Tyler, stop touching things that aren't yours." Tyler had already pulled his hands away and was inspecting them. The sticky substance was golden and translucent. He sniffed it. It smelled like flowers. And something else. Something he couldn't place. "Yes, yes," Molly Mapplethorpe cooed. "I believe the former owner was a backyard beekeeper. Isn't that adorable? That's what this neighborhood is all about. Getting back to simpler times. Lots of folks around here grow their own vegetables, raise chickens." As if on cue, a rooster crowed. They all looked around but couldn't place the sound. It crowed again. Once. Twice. But then the crowing noise morphed into a strange cackle. Molly interrupted. "It's so pastoral, isn't it? Have you ever considered keeping bees?" Tyler stretched the goo between his fingers, sniffed it again, and then cautiously stuck out the tip of his tongue to taste it. Oh my. It was delicious. "Funny you should ask," answered Wren, with a thoughtful hand on his beard. "I'm a strong believer in the importance of self-sufficiency." Tyler stuck a sticky finger in his mouth. Honey. "People these days are far too soft. They allow the government to do everything for them." Drool dripped down Tyler's chin as he lapped the goo from his hands. "I don't think people these days care about survival the way they should. Sometimes we just have to buckle down and make sacrifices." Tyler felt funny. His vision began to blur. The only thing in focus was the makeshift hive. Honey. Oh, that honey. It was amazing. It was important. The honey on his hands was gone, and he needed more. He rushed toward the wooden box and pressed his tongue against the crevice where the sticky goo hid. "Tyler," his father yelled. "You're 8 years old. Act your age." Tyler felt the grip of his father's hand crush his bicep as he was yanked away from the hive. Then he felt the harsh slap of his father's other hand against his face. In the background, Molly Mapplethorpe gasped at the sight. "What did I tell you?" Wren boomed. Tyler thought his father's voice sounded strange, like it was coming through an old radio, the signal buzzing slightly over the air. He looked up. In front of him, 100 tiny wrens danced about, as though he were looking through a kaleidoscope. But his attention's focus was singular. His father's commanding voice, usually terrifying, was calming. His desire for honey disappeared temporarily. He felt unusually compelled to do whatever his father said. "I'm sorry, Father," Tyler said, in a soft, obedient tone. "You're right. I'll stand still." Wren released the boy, and Tyler stood catatonically at his side. Surprised, Wren cleared his throat and said, "Thank you." Then Wren turned to the agent. "I'm sorry for his little outburst." Molly Mapplethorpe forced a smile. "Not at all." "We'll take it," said his father. "Wonderful," the agent replied. "I'll draw up the paperwork right away." The adults began to walk towards the house, away from the hives, and Tyler followed. As the spell cast by his father's voice faded, all he could think about was the honey. The delicious, sugary honey. And how much he wanted more of it. He couldn't wait to move into the new house, and for his father to start raising bees. Then there'd be plenty of honey. Plenty for Tyler and his dad. And Tyler would do anything for more. 1. Archer Abel stood under the awning of the Knoxville Middle School bus circle after school, sweating in the mid-November heat. It was unseasonably warm for Lost Key, Florida, but that wasn't what was making Archer perspire. Was it obvious that something shady was going down, he wondered? Or did it just look like a couple of honor roll nerds having a random conversation? He glanced around cautiously to make sure no one was looking. But most of the Knoxville Middle School students and teachers had already gone home. Archer and his classmate Parker Rush were the only ones around. Still, he hunched over secretively as he flipped open a wrinkled white envelope and inspected what was left of his birthday money. 20 measly dollars. He sighed as he pulled out half. "Here you go," Archer said, with a note of dismay. Parker snatched the bill, eager green eyes and red freckles bouncing. "Awesome," he chirped. He stuffed the cash into his pocket. As Parker rummaged through his backpack for the trade, Archer tugged nervously at his bow tie. All of a sudden, it felt tight. At least he had worn it with a short-sleeved cotton shirt, but the selvaged jeans had been a mistake. Too heavy on a day as muggy as this. Should have worn linen shorts. His only consolation was that he knew he looked fantastic. Unlike Parker, who wore faded clothes that were woefully undersized and clashed terribly with his red hair. Archer thought he should have paid Parker in fashion advice instead of money. Finally, Parker's hand emerged with a stapled bunch of papers. He handed them to Archer. Common Misconceptions About the Slave Trade in the U.S. by Archer Abel, read the title page. Archer gasped. "Archie! What were you thinking?" "No one calls me that." Parker winced. "Oh, sorry. I can fix it. First thing in the morning. Meet me here before school?" Archer sighed again. "Don't worry about it. Mrs. Wesson probably won't even notice. But next time? Next time? There's another essay due in 2 weeks. That one is supposed to extol the virtues of Andrew Jackson's humanitarian efforts to preserve American Indians. Ugh, as though what he did wasn't both immoral and illegal." Archer rolled his eyes dramatically as he said this. Parker looked confused. Archer explained. Andrew Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act in order to forcibly segregate Native Americans, even though the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. But you can't say that, remember? That's why I hired you to write the essays for me. Just thinking about the revisionist history they're teaching us makes me gag. No way I'm spending my precious time writing it down. Right, Parker said. But Archer could tell that giving a pass to white colonialist supremacy wasn't as much of a problem for Parker as it was for him. "Okay, well, thanks again. See you later," Parker said, tossing his backpack over his shoulder. As Parker trotted off, Archer went back to inspecting the paper. The rubric for Mrs. Wesson's history assignment stipulated that students demonstrate a fair and balanced approach to the discussion of slavery, which their textbook called Black immigration. Northern and Southern viewpoints must be considered equally, she had written. That was just a fancy way of saying that Mrs. Wesson wanted the students to gloss over any facts that might be offensive to fragile white egos. Although it is agreed that Southern workers were sometimes treated unfairly, Parker had written. The country prior to the Civil War was a complicated and divided nation, and historians are still not in agreement with regards to the exact cause or outcomes of the War of Northern Aggression. Parker had followed Mrs. Wesson's directions perfectly, just like he had done on the last 2 essays Archer had paid him to write. Both of those essays had received A's. Archer took a deep breath. He wondered what his mother would have said if she'd read the essay. She probably would have demanded that Archer tell the truth, regardless of the rubric. But then he would have received a failing grade. And then what would have been the point of moving to Lost Key to live with his grandparents? His parents had moved him temporarily because Knoxville was far safer than his home school, and it had a renowned math and science program. If he continued to be a straight-A student, he could apply for an academic scholarship to the best private high school in Mobile. And if he did well there, he planned on applying to Harvard. Archer wasn't about to risk his academic goals when he could just pay someone like Parker to do the dirty job of writing revisionist history essays for him. Except, Parker charged $10 per essay, and Archer only had $10 left. One more payment, and then he'd have to write the essays himself. Ugh. Archer carefully slid the essay into a folder in his backpack and began the humid walk back to his grandparents' house. "Hey, Archer! Wait up!" a voice called from behind. Archer turned to face Mabel Mundell, his best friend and confidant. Mabel's long, black hair splayed out behind her like a cape as she ran. Her Converse sneakers slapped the concrete as she slowed to walk in step beside him. "Did I just see you talking to Parker Rush?" Mabel asked in surprise. "I didn't know you were friends." "Hi," Archer responded, ignoring her question. "What were you still doing at school? You never stay after." "Makeup quiz, so I don't fail pre-algebra." Mabel ran an arm over her forehead, wiping away sweat. She was dressed for mid-January in a long-sleeve raglan tee and overalls. Archer shook his head with a laugh. She had no more fashion sense than Parker, but he knew better than to argue with her choices. Mabel Mundell had a mind of her own about everything. "You know, you could always ask me to tutor you," Archer offered. "I don't need tutoring, Mr. Smarty Pants," Mabel scoffed. "I know how to math." Yes, of course. That must be why you're failing." They turned a corner down a long, flat expanse of sidewalk that crossed into a tract neighborhood of 1960s homes, all lined up in neat little rows. Mabel reached up and twisted her silky black hair into a bun that she held on top of her head so her neck could air out as they walked. "I'm very smart," Mabel argued. "I just don't care as much about my grades as you do. In fact, I don't know why you care at all. They don't even teach us anything useful." Archer considered his history curriculum and thought Mabel had a point, but he countered anyway with, "It isn't always about what they teach, Mabel. Making good grades opens doors for your future." Blah. Mabel stuck out her tongue. "You sound like Mr. Jones, the guidance counselor. That's the kind of blah, blah, blah he would say on career day." "Well, he's not wrong." Archer switched his backpack from one shoulder to the other. "If you got good grades, you could get into a good college, and then you could have a high-paying job someday." He shot Mabel a provocative side-eye. "Unless you plan on babysitting for the rest of your life." "Oh, speaking of babysitting," Mabel gave a little hop. "You said you might be interested in earning some money. Something about Taylor Swift?" "Harry Styles," he corrected her. Archer had almost given up on the idea of buying concert tickets, given that he had pretty much blown his savings paying for his history essays. "Whatever. The point is, I have a job for you, if you're still interested." Archer wasn't the least bit interested in babysitting, but he was interested in the money. "So, you make, like, $30 an hour, still. Yes! Can you believe? Mabel squealed as they approached his grandparents' immaculate home. It was a quaint brick ranch house with a cozy concrete front porch, deep awnings over the windows, and a set of perfectly round bushes lining the driveway. Archer's grandpa Bob had meticulously manicured the landscaping until it looked like something out of a video game. It was that picture perfect. Archer checked the manatee-shaped mailbox on their way in, then pulled his keyring out of his pocket to get in the front door. No, I cannot believe they pay you that much. What's the catch? Their feet echoed as they crossed the tile entry to the dining room, where Archer placed the mail in a wicker basket. Mabel beelined for the kitchen, following the heavenly aroma of Grandma Dinette's baking. Mabel moaned. What is that smell? Archer's grandmother stood at the oven, pulling a tray of baked goods out of the oven with a mitted hand. Honey bars, said Dinette in her charming southern drawl. She placed the tray on the counter. Give it a minute to cool before digging in, okay? Archer put his backpack in one of the kitchen table chairs and went to give his grandma a hug. Hi, sweetheart, she said, squeezing him back. How was school? Great, Archer said, and he took a seat at the kitchen table, facing away from his grandmother so she wouldn't see the sour look his face made every time he lied. The guilt of paying someone to write his essays was crushing. He didn't want to think about what would happen if she ever found out her grandson wasn't as picture-perfect as their lawn. Wonderful, Dinette replied, distracted. Y'all sit tight while those honey bars cool. I'm going to go wash up. All that baking made me work up a sweat. Be right back. With that, Dinette removed her apron, hung it on a hook in the pantry, and left the room. Mabel took a seat next to Archer. So, the babysitting job? Was that a yes? Mabel's eyebrows rose expectantly. Archer pursed his lips and crossed his arms over his chest. I'm going to need more information. How about you start by telling me about your last babysitting job on Spite Lane? 2. Ever since Mabel had started babysitting on Spite Lane a few weeks earlier, she'd been cagey about the details. If her friends asked any questions, she would change the subject or find a reason to walk away. This time, she hopped up from her spot at the table and began rooting through the refrigerator, stalling. Mabel, seriously? What happened? Archer pressed. Nothing. It was nothing. Just the usual, Mabel insisted, digging around inside the fridge. Watch the kid, play with the kid, get paid, go home. She pulled out a carton of milk and took it to the counter. Archer continued to probe. Mabel, this is Spite Lane we're talking about. Are you telling me there was nothing unusual about the babysitting job? Everyone in Lost Key had heard the rumors that Spite Lane was haunted. Kids loved to scare each other with stories about how the houses tortured their inhabitants in unique and violent ways. Archer didn't totally believe in ghosts, but he felt the rumors had to have been based in some kind of reality. What about the kid? Archer asked. Did you get any Children of the Corn vibes? Mabel found a glass in the pantry and poured the milk into it, taking a long sip before answering. Nope. Mabel wasn't known for her brevity. Archer's frown deepened. Something's up. What are you not telling me? Mabel stared at Archer with a hard look. Archer couldn't read her face, but he got the impression there was something she wanted to tell him. She just didn't know how. He was about to push harder when his grandmother walked back in. Before going to the counter, she paused briefly to kiss Archer on the top of the head. I'm so proud of you, she said. She went to the counter and grabbed a knife from a drawer. Tapping the bars to check their temperature and finding them just cool enough, she pressed the knife into them and cut out a bar. She lifted it, set it on a small plate, and handed it to Archer. Archer took the honey bar with a pained smile. Mabel could barely contain her excitement. She held out her hands to receive the bar before Dinette had a chance to cut another one. Once the bar hit Mabel's plate, she immediately snatched it up and stuffed it into her mouth. Mmm, Mabel moaned. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Dinette chuckled. Goodness. Doesn't your mother feed you? No, but my brother feeds me, Mabel said, with a stuffed mouth. Dinette cut her another bar. Well, tell him to feed you more often. Meanwhile, Archer picked fussily at his bar, putting what amounted to mere crumbs in his mouth. You can both have as many as you like, Dinette said, placing another bar next to Archer's barely eaten one. Gotta keep my hard-working grandson fueled so he can keep making honor roll. She gave him a wink. These are so good, Mabel cooed, reaching for a third bar. Noticing Mabel's glass, Dinette asked Archer, Do you need some milk too, sweetie? No, but thank you, Archer said. Dinette topped off Mabel's glass and put the milk back in the fridge. Well, then, I'll let you two get back to chatting. I assume you have lots of homework. If you need anything, I'll be out back watering the bougainvillea. Dinette waved as she exited through the back door. As soon as she was gone, Archer wanted to continue where they left off, talking about Spite Lane. But Mabel rushed to the table with her own inquisition. What gives? You haven't touched your bar. Don't you love them? They're so good. Archer blew it off with a wave of his hand. I guess I'm not hungry. You want it? Mabel grabbed the uneaten bar and stuffed it in her mouth. I don't get it. You love sweets, she argued around the food. I know. Archer rose to fetch a paper towel. He used it to carefully wrap up the partially eaten bar, which he then stuffed into the bottom of the trash can under the counter. What are you doing? Mabel yelled, leaping after him with an unsuccessful attempt to save the dessert. Archer huffed. She makes me these bars all the time, he explained. I used to love them, like really love them. Then one day, I ate an entire tray in one sitting while my grandma wasn't looking. It made me so sick. I threw up for hours. Now I can't stand the taste. Then why does she make them for you? I never told her about it. It was years ago. If I told her now, it's too late. You could just tell her to make you something else. I feel too guilty. Archer shivered as though trying to shake away the feeling. It's easier just to let her think I love them. Know what I mean? Mabel, suddenly serious, nodded. Yeah, I know what you mean. Then she turned to the bars. But I'm taking a bunch of these to go. Archer snorted. Be my guest. He found a plastic baggie in the pantry. As Mabel placed as many bars as she could fit into the bag, she said, Hey, listen, I gotta go. But I'm serious about the babysitting thing. I got 2 offers for the same time, so I can't take them both. I'll even give you the easier one, since you're a babysitting noob. Gee, thanks. Archer huffed. It's this guy who just moved to town with his son. The kid is 8. Just wants someone to keep an eye on him for an hour every afternoon while he's out back tending his bees. Bees? Yeah, he's like a backyard beekeeper or something. His backyard. Is that safe? I don't know. Mabel licked her fingers before picking up her backpack. I'm sure it's fine. You'll probably hang out, like, inside the house or whatever. It's not like there are bees in there. And he's paying $30 an hour. You're sure? Archer said, following her. Yeah, Mabel said, fast walking to the front door. Starts tomorrow. Tomorrow? After school? How are you getting there? Sivan can drive us, Mabel said, referencing her older brother as she stepped out the door and onto the front walkway. Pick you up at 4. Be ready. See you. Mabel jogged away without looking back. Archer knew Mabel was keeping something from him, but he couldn't imagine what. Obviously, if Spite Lane were haunted and they were in danger, Mabel wouldn't take another babysitting job there, would she? It had to be something else. Archer closed the front door and went back to the kitchen. He didn't know what was up with Mabel, but there was one thing he couldn't deny. $30 was more than enough money to keep Parker writing his U.S. history essays through the end of the semester. 3. Tuesday afternoon, Archer went straight home from school, pretended to love his grandmother's honey bars, finished one of his homework assignments, and waited for Mabel and Sivan to show up. Throughout all of this, he tried not to think about how nervous he was to babysit. Archer really wasn't into childcare. He didn't have any younger siblings, and he'd never babysat before. He found most kids annoying. They weren't born with manners, and some parents never taught them any. They were loud, messy, and often rude. He wasn't looking forward to wrangling an unruly 8-year-old. But Mabel swore babysitting was easy. Most kids these days have a phone or a tablet. Screen time practically does all the work for you. Archer hoped Mabel was right. Sivan's car rolled up to the house right on time. Archer hopped into the back seat and slammed the creaky passenger door shut. Hey, Archer, how you doing? Sivan asked as they drove off. They made small talk all the way to Spite Lane. Spite Lane. Once the conversation died down, Archer realized the significance of this short trip. He was about to visit the fabled neighborhood for the first time. He had told his grandparents he had a babysitting job, but he hadn't told them where. As Sivan pulled over onto the shoulder of Blue Angel Parkway, Archer looked out at the shrouded opening in the pines. An overgrown gravel path led through the trees. It didn't look like an entrance to a neighborhood. It didn't even look like there was enough space for a car to drive through. How could anyone live there? And why would anyone want to? Archer worried he had made a huge mistake and thought there was no way his grandparents would have ever let him go if they had known. Was it too late to turn around? Mabel hopped out of the car before Archer could suggest they call it off. Archer took that as his cue and followed. No way he would be doing this if it weren't for Mabel. Her steadfast confidence gave him strength. As she strode through the tunnel of foliage, Archer sensed the shift in climate. The sky was overcast even though it had just been sunny. There was a briskly cold breeze, even though all day it had been muggy and warm. Archer wrapped his arms around himself and glanced up at the branches overhead. There was no sign of life. Nary a bird or a squirrel in sight. Mabel took them past the dilapidated old gates that once marked a grand entrance to Spitzer Lane? Archer had forgotten until he saw the sign. The original developer of the neighborhood had been named Gabriel Spitzer. The Z and the R had faded, perhaps washed away by numerous storms in the century since the neighborhood had been built. Had the rumors of the hauntings come before or after the sign looked like it said Spite Lane. Archer wondered why no one had ever bothered to maintain the neighborhood's entrance. The stacked stone columns that held broken wrought iron gates must have been an elegant sight when first built. The sign hung from a decorative metal post with intricately curling scrollwork. Gaslit lamps, their glass and bulbs long since shattered, must have provided a warm, glowing light back in the day. To Archer, it was a beautiful eyesore, and he felt a little sad about how it must feel to the people living on Spite Lane to have to pass through these gates every day. He made a mental note to come back at some point and do something, even if just pull the weeds, to make the entrance slightly more hospitable. He could even earn Honor Society service hours for it. On the other side of the gates, the pines quickly opened to the neighborhood he'd heard everyone talk about. It was just as described. The lane wound over and around houses that were perched atop mounds of grass. Archer remembered hearing that the developer had done this to make sure the houses never flooded. The houses had been built before there were levees that now kept Lost Bay from encroaching during a storm. But the effect of the mounds was to make the houses look like the earth below them had erupted in a pox. And the way the houses all sat in disarray? Archer had always imagined Spite Lane to look like a street with a straight row of houses side by side, placed symmetrically up and down the road. Instead, it was like a giant had shuffled the houses in their palms and then tossed them like dice into the field. Archer felt compelled to pick them up and put them where they logically belonged. As they passed the houses, Archer began playing a game with himself, trying to figure out, if he had been the developer, how he would have arranged the houses. Which ones looked best side by side? There was a tall, skinny greenhouse with buttercream trim and a strange colonnade in front that appeared to have been added long after the house had been built. That one, Archer imagined, would go next to the squat purple house with the low eaves. There was a bright yellow house, pretty color, but the paint was peeling, and an ochre house with a sagging, freestanding garage, and a house the color of the chartreuse liqueur his grandmother liked to pour over vanilla ice cream. Kind of a yellow-green. Clearly, those could not be right next to each other. Their colors were too similar. They needed to stand next to warm-colored homes to break up the monotony. That was when Mabel caught Archer's attention. She had stopped in front of a dark brown house with green trim that had a sold sign in the front yard. "This is you," she said, pointing at the house. This house would go nicely next to the ochre house, Archer thought. And then he realized how silly he was being, trying to rearrange the houses in his mind. It was childish. Maybe that was a good thing. He was going to have to reconnect with his imagination if he was to keep an 8-year-old occupied. "You all good?" Mabel asked, snapping him out of his reverie. Archer stared at the house. "Yeah," he said, even though his skin prickled with fear. "If you need anything, I'm right next door," Mabel said, pointing at the house whose rear faced the Timberlakes. "Sounds good," Archer said, but he didn't move. This was it. There was no going back. Just focus on the money, he told himself. It's only an hour. No big deal. He put one foot in front of the other until he had successfully scaled the front steps and was at the front door. Archer pushed the doorbell and heard a low chime ring inside. Footsteps clapped and the door opened with a squeak. The man in front of him stood tall and firm, like a sturdy tree. He had a curly beard and a flannel button-down shirt. Archer relaxed a little, digging the stern lumberjack vibe. "Hi, are you Mr. Timberlake? I'm Archer, your babysitter." Archer put out his hand, and the older man took it and gave it a gruff shake. Archer noted the gritty texture of the man's palms. Maybe he was a lumberjack after all. "Come in," the man said in a deep, gravelly tone. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "No problem. Mabel wanted to babysit for you, but she was already booked." The man popped his chin downwards in a curt nod, as though he had already heard this from Mabel. "So, your son's name is Tyler?" Archer asked, in as professional a tone as he could muster. His eyes scanned the living room for the boy. "Yes," Mr. Timberlake said, as he led Archer inside. "Nice. Where is the, little tyke?" He winced at his own choice of words, thinking he sounded as green behind the ears as he felt. Mr. Timberlake didn't answer, just kept walking. Once Mr. Timberlake had closed the front door, the air stilled, and Archer noticed a strange sound, like a buzz coming from the rear of the home, like the hum of a backup generator. Otherwise, the house was quiet. The thick, floor-to-ceiling curtains were drawn, and only a few lamps were lit. They glowed warmly against the dark hardwood floors and stairs. Some of the furniture was still covered in sheets, and the rug had been rolled up and placed against the foot of the far wall. One thing Archer noted: no screens, not a television or a projector, no sign of any tablets or phones. Mr. Timberlake took Archer into the kitchen where the sound grew louder. Archer saw the boy standing next to the kitchen table, back turned, gently rocking up and down on his toes. Archer realized the sound was coming from the boy. He emitted a constant monotone hum. As he rocked, the volume of the tone followed a beat. Louder, softer, louder, softer. Archer found it mildly hypnotic. "Tyler," Mr. Timberlake called, and the boy spun around to face Archer, still humming. His face was soft but square. He had dark brown eyes and sandy brown hair. He was of slight build, skinny for a little kid, Archer thought, and his fingers twitched strangely as he stared back at Archer. "This is—" The father stopped. He looked at Archer. "Archer Abel," Archer replied. "I'm your new babysitter." He tried to say these things with confidence, but the boy's eyes were so large and inquisitive, he felt unarmed. "Be in charge," he thought to himself, as though childcare were all about domination. Survival of the fittest. Show him who's boss. The boy didn't say anything. He kept humming and staring, humming and staring. Archer found this odd, but he'd never babysat before. Maybe this was what all children were like? The father didn't seem concerned. "I don't normally hire babysitters," Mr. Timberlake explained. "Tyler's 8. 8 should be old enough to take care of oneself." The man's mouth pursed as though he hated what he was about to say. "But Tyler has an unusual amount of energy for a child his age." "That's not a problem," Archer said, with false confidence. "I can keep him occupied while you keep I heard you're a beekeeper?" Wren Timberlake's eyes narrowed. "Yes, it seems I am." Archer waited for him to go on. "We moved here a few weeks ago. The previous owner kept bees. Now I manage their activity." "Do they make a lot of honey?" Archer probed. The father responded with a grunt. "It would seem so. With that, the man turned to the kitchen counter where 4 glass jars sat, 3 empty and one with a small amount of dark, greenish-gold honey at the bottom. Unlike the honey Dinette bought at the store in a bear-shaped plastic squeeze bottle, this honey was firm and cloudy. At the sound of the word honey, Tyler had stopped humming and slowly approached his father until he was standing beside him. He stared at the partially filled jar. Wren Timberlake picked up the jar and pulled something out of it. A wooden dipper with a beehive-shaped scoop at the end. "Tyler likes this honey quite a bit," Wren said, handing the apparatus to his son. "Is it okay to give him some if he asks for it?" asked Archer. Tyler stuck the entire dipper in his mouth like a lollipop. "Yes." Mr. Timberlake cleared his throat. "In fact, I recommend you feed it to him often." Archer's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Often?" Mr. Timberlake looked Archer squarely in the eye. His stare had a fierce intensity that Archer found intimidating. "Honey has a number of health-giving properties. It's a natural antiseptic and antifungal. It contains numerous minerals. And some people find it soothing." Archer nodded, listening. "It's important Tyler stays calm," the man said with seriousness. "Beekeeping is delicate business. The previous beekeeper didn't employ best practices and left the colonies in very bad shape. The clock is ticking, and I have a lot of work to do to prepare the hives for winter, or we could lose the colony. I can't have Tyler running about, making a ruckus." "Of course. Yes," said Archer, nodding more vigorously. "We'll do something calm while you're working. I'll make sure he doesn't disturb you one bit." He addressed Tyler. "Do you have any favorite books? I could read one of them to you." The boy said nothing, just hummed. Wonderful, Archer thought, as fear sliced through him. He had no idea what he was doing. This could be a disaster. 4. "Tyler, I'll be out back. You mind Archer now. You hear?" Mr. Timberlake seemed to trust that he could leave Archer in charge without waiting for confirmation from either of them. Once he was out the back door, Archer was on his own. Tyler Timberlake, with the dipper stick hanging lazily from his mouth, stood staring at Archer. He seemed to be waiting for further instruction. "So, do you want to show me your room?" Archer asked. The boy began to walk away, but Archer called, "Wait!" He gently pulled the dipper from the boy's mouth and took it to the sink, where he rinsed it off and set it down. "Okay, now we're ready." They scaled the stairs together. Tyler took Archer to a room down a narrow hall with wainscoting painted the color of a rusty tractor. Archer noted the dark wood rails and the beadboard ceiling. The house was so much older and fancier than either his grandparents' house or his home back in Mobile. "It sure is beautiful," he thought, even though it obviously needed some elbow grease here and there. Tyler's room was narrow and rectangular. It was sparsely decorated. There was a twin bed, a set of shelves with a few books and wooden toys, and an oval, multicolored braided rag rug in the center of the floor. Archer realized what a huge house it was for just 2 people to be living in it. He wondered if they ever got lonely. Tyler stood next to the shelves as though waiting for Archer to select something to read. Archer found a copy of The Wind in the Willows, one of his favorites when he was smaller. He held it up. "How about this one?" Tyler climbed onto the bed, so Archer sat next to him and cracked open the spine. He began to read aloud and was surprised by his own inflection. He'd never read a book out loud to a little kid before. After a few pages, he found himself really getting into it, making voices and even waving around his free hand. But over time, Tyler, who had been rapt at first, began to fidget. His toes wiggled, then his knees popped up and down. He bounced lightly, then slid onto the floor and tapped his feet. Archer tried saying things like, "Sit down, please," and "Tyler, please stay still." But the more time passed, the more restless he became until Archer couldn't do or say anything that would keep him quiet. Archer checked his smartwatch. It had been only 20 minutes since he'd started the babysitting job. Tyler began to spin aimlessly around the room. He looked out the window. He rolled under the bed. He took all the toys off of the shelf, played with them for mere seconds, then tossed them away. He flipped through the books and turned the light switch on and off and used the bed cover like a cape. Throughout this, he became more and more verbal. At first, he commanded Archer to look at everything he was doing. Then he started asking questions. "How old are you? Do you like ice cream? How many brothers and sisters do you have?" Then he began to answer his own questions. "Have you ever looked at Jupiter through a telescope?" "I have. It was really big. It was kind of fuzzy. They say it has an eye. Did you know about the eye? It's not really an eye, though. It's just gas. Not farting gas. But that would be funny, wouldn't it? If planets could fart." He laughed maniacally. Then he began making farting noises, cracking himself up. He blew raspberries louder and louder, running around in circles, spraying saliva everywhere. Archer watched all of this with disgust and fascination. It was like Tyler had turned into a completely different kid. This must have been what his dad was talking about when he said Tyler had a lot of energy. Tyler ran over to Archer and blew raspberries all over Archer's face. Saliva speckled his cheeks. Disgusting. Archer felt mild rage. This was why he didn't like little kids. They were like wild animals. Tyler's dad had also said honey had calming properties. "I recommend you feed it to him often." "Hey, Tyler," Archer said, trying to get the boy's attention. Eventually, he had to go over and place his hands on Tyler's shoulders to force him to stop running around. "Tyler? Tyler?" The boy looked up at Archer with crazed eyes. "How about some more honey? How does that sound?" "Honey! I love honey!" Archer sighed. "Great. Let's go get some more." The jar was almost empty, and Tyler was ravenous. A few scoops of the dipper, and it was all gone. Archer watched Tyler become practically catatonic compared to how he had been acting mere minutes earlier. Archer didn't know much about the health-giving properties of honey, but this was kind of bizarre. He didn't remember ever feeling this effect when his mom put honey in his hibiscus tea. "Do you want to read more books?" Archer asked. "Or maybe we could do something else. Do you have any board games? Checkers? Chess?" Tyler didn't answer. Instead, he started humming again, a low, resonant buzz. Archer walked around the kitchen, investigating inside the cabinets for something to do. There weren't any board games, but he found pens and paper. He figured they could play tic-tac-toe. As he led Tyler to the kitchen table, they crossed in front of a window that looked out over the backyard. Archer spotted Mr. Timberlake, all suited up in a white outfit that covered him head to toe. The cylindrical hood had a black screen to cover his face, presumably to protect him from any bee stings. He carried a large metal canister that sprayed smoke in a thick stream over the boxes of hives. Archer wondered what the smoke was for. Maybe he would ask Mr. Timberlake later. At the table, Archer and Tyler played round after round of tic-tac-toe. But just as before, the boy gradually became restless. Archer checked his watch. He was only 45 minutes into his hour-long babysitting session. He needed to calm Tyler down for a few more minutes. When Archer went to the counter, he found the last jar of honey empty. Another scan of the cabinets, and there was no more to be found. "Tyler, do you know if your dad has any more honey in the house?" The boy hopped up and began skipping towards the living room. Archer panicked when he thought the boy was headed for the front door. He couldn't let Tyler go outside. If the kid disturbed his dad, Archer would never be invited to babysit again. He was about to grab Tyler when the kid made a sharp right turn. He circled, stopped, and hopped in place next to a small door under the stairs, waiting. Curious, Archer opened the small door and felt a cool, musty puff of air hit his cheeks. He smelled fresh dirt and something else, something sickly sweet. Another set of stairs with open, rough-hewn wood treads led down into a dark cellar. Archer looked for a light switch, but there was none. The boy hummed at Archer impatiently. There must be more honey down there, Archer thought. He hoped there was a light switch at the bottom of the stairs. He descended, noticing within a few steps the cellar wasn't completely dark. There was a light somewhere below that glowed faint and green, like a glow stick on Halloween night. The humming intensified. He glanced back, expecting to see Tyler on his tail, but Tyler was at the top of the steps, silhouetted, waiting. Archer cocked his head. The humming came from down below. At the bottom of the stairs, Archer stepped onto the packed dirt floor and scanned the room. There was a set of floor-to-ceiling shelves immediately ahead, and each shelf was flush with glass jars. The jars were glowing. They were full of an iridescent liquid. Was it honey? Archer walked over and picked one up. Sure enough, the viscous liquid moved slowly back and forth as he tilted the jar. It certainly looked and acted like honey. But why was it glowing like a lightning bug on a summer night? Did this mean it was old or spoiled? How could he know if it was fresh and safe for Tyler to eat? Archer turned to take the honey upstairs where he could inspect it more closely in the daylight. It shone brightly in his hand, a dim lantern in the dark. That was when Archer saw the rest of the basement. The walls were moving, vibrating, as though they were made of liquid too. Archer approached the wall next to the staircase and held out the jar of glowing honey to get a better look. The buzzing was louder than ever now. And that's when Archer saw the walls were covered in bees. Their black and yellow bodies wiggled back and forth, and their wings beat rapidly in unison. They coated the walls like a carpet from top to bottom and side to side. Looking up, Archer saw they also covered the ceiling. They were everywhere, except on the jars of honey or the stairs themselves. He didn't pause to think of what might happen if they were disturbed. Archer sprinted up the staircase as fast as he could, holding the jar of honey in his hand. As soon as his feet hit the landing, he slammed the tiny door shut behind him. He leaned against it, shivering with fear. Tyler's eyes were glued to the jar. Archer glanced down at it. The liquid no longer glowed bright green. It looked perfectly normal. Just a regular old jar of creamy golden honey with a small piece of honeycomb sticking up near the top. Tyler took the jar out of Archer's hands, unscrewed it, and jabbed a chubby finger inside. He scooped out a chunk of the runny goo and wrapped his mouth around it, closing his eyes, murmuring softly in delight. But Archer was certain he could still hear the buzzing of bees below. And he had no idea what to do. 5. So, then what happened? Archer's friend Suki leaned over the lunchroom table and stared at him with giant black eyes surrounded by soft pink eyeshadow as she asked the question. She twirled her chunky amethyst necklace with one hand, being careful not to tangle her black and pink hair as she fidgeted. Knowing Suki, Archer thought she would be very disappointed if he didn't mention ghosts or spirits. Next to Suki, Mabel and their friend Fernanda also waited for Archer to finish telling them what had happened during his babysitting visit to Spite Lane. Tyler's dad came in from outside, paid me, and I left, Archer said. He took a bite of his turkey sandwich and shrugged. That's it, Suki cried, dropping the necklace and letting it noisily drop onto the lunch table. Did you at least tell the dad what you saw? Fernanda asked, with a confused frown. Archer chewed and swallowed. I mean, he has to already know there are bees in his cellar, right? It's his house. Fair point, replied Fernanda, letting it drop. Mabel pursed her lips uncomfortably. Her aromatic curry sat untouched in her tiffin. She poked at it with a fork, then tried to change the conversation. So, hey, y'all, I was thinking we could hang out this weekend and— Wait, Suki cried dramatically, preventing Mabel from moving on. Archer, you have to talk to the dad. What if he doesn't know he has bees in the basement? What if they're haunted bees? We're talking about Spite Lane after all. I'm sure the bees aren't haunted, Mabel scoffed, with an exaggerated roll of her eyes. Haunted or not haunted? Either way, I'm not going back, Archer said, wiping away crumbs from the corners of his mouth. What? Mabel exclaimed, slapping her hand on the table. Not going back? You're supposed to babysit again tomorrow. Touchy, Archer scolded. Why do you even care? Because, Mabel stuttered. It's my reputation on the line? I'm the one that got you that job, and I'm the one that will be in trouble if you don't return. Archer narrowed his eyes. The way Mabel said it, he didn't think that was the main reason. Once again, she was acting strangely. Archer sighed. Look, between the bees and the weird smoke thing, it just doesn't feel right. I'm not going back. I'm sorry, Mabel. You'll need to find someone else. Suki sat up straight with excitement and clapped her hands. I could do it. I could try to speak to the bees. Find out what they want. Suki Saito was a firm believer in magic and mysticism. She helped her mother, a semi-famous psychic on TikTok, provide palm and tarot readings at local festivals. And she was certain she had second sight, a kind of clairvoyance that would allow her to talk to the dead and see into the future. She was always looking for opportunities to hone her clairvoyant gifts. This is good, Suki said dreamily. I've always wanted to find out what's really going on over at Spite Lane. The bees must know something. I'm sure all the bees want is their hive back, Mabel argued. What weird smoke thing? Fernanda asked Archer, circling back. Archer explained. At one point, I looked outside and Mr. Timberlake was outside using this big can to spray smoke at the hives. It was super weird. I was going to ask him about it, but he waved his hand dismissively as his voice trailed off. Smoke is sometimes used to clear bees out of their hive, Fernanda explained, so the beekeeper can clean or repair it. Oh, Archer said. That makes sense. Mr. Timberlake said he had a lot of work to do to prep the hives for winter. If he left a window to the cellar open, maybe the bees flew inside, Fernanda continued. Maybe he smoked them into his own house, accidentally. Archer considered this. I suppose that might have been it. But it was so many bees. Like millions. You said it was dark down there, Mabel jumped in, latching on to Fernanda's explanation. Are you sure there were millions of bees? It could have been your eyes playing tricks on you. Archer scowled at Mabel. If you go back, let me go with you, Suki offered. Maybe the previous owner of the house died, and the bees were there to mourn him. We could hold a seance, and I'm not going back, Archer said, eating the last of his sandwich and noisily opening a baggie of chips. He pulled out a chip and wagged it at Suki and the others. And that's final. When the bell rang at the end of the school day, Archer gathered his things and made his way into the hallway towards the back doors of the school. The crowd of Knoxville students moved forward sluggishly as those boarding school buses or waiting for parents to pick them up blocked the way of those who lived close enough to walk. It was no matter. Archer wasn't in a hurry. He stuck his hands in his pockets where his fingers hit his wallet. Unconsciously, he grinned in pride. With $10 of remaining birthday cash and $30 from his babysitting gig, there was enough for 4 more history papers. He felt slightly guilty about leaving Mabel in the lurch, but with $40, he had plenty of time to figure out a new money-making enterprise, one with fewer insects. Archer's reverie was broken by the uncomfortable feeling of someone bumping into him from behind, over and over. As soon as they were out the door, Archer moved to the side, hoping the other student would pass. Instead, he felt breath on his ear. I know your dirty little secret, Archer Abel, said a stinky whisper. Archer looked back and saw Gus Rumson, linebacker for the Knoxville football team, giving him a knowing smirk. He suddenly knew what it meant to have his blood run cold. Why don't we have a chat? Breathed Gus. Archer held his breath as Gus hooked an arm through Archer's and led them to a patch of grass adjacent to the bus circle. I don't know what you're talking about, Archer stammered. Sure you do, said Gus, as he backed Archer up against a brick wall. I saw you and that nerd Parker yesterday, and when I asked him about what you were talking about, he told me everything. Whatever he said, he was lying. I'm sure he wasn't, Gus said, leaning in so close Archer could feel his breath. Gus lowered his voice. You know, I could use some help with my history homework, too. Gus smelled like he'd eaten onion rings with garlic dip for lunch. Archer held his breath. Too bad I don't have any cash, Gus went on. But I bet you could lend me some. Couldn't you? Archer looked around for a teacher, but no one was in sight. Just students, and none of them gave a hoot about Archer or Gus. Archer felt like throwing up. I don't have any money. Sorry, Archer groaned. You sure about that? I'd hate to find out you were lying. I might have to go tell the teacher what's really going on. No, Archer blurted emphatically. He reached into his pocket. Hold on. Maybe I have something. Archer slipped out his wallet out of his pants. But before he could look inside, Gus snatched it and stuffed it into his coat. I'll be taking that, Archie, my old friend, Gus said sarcastically. I'll keep it safe for you until we meet again. Now, why don't you go home, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened. Archer gulped. Gus gave Archer a patronizing pat on the cheek and walked away. Archer was left reeling in shock and shame. 6. The big brown house stood tall enough to block the sun. Archer stared at it in dismay. He'd spent the last 24 hours trying to figure out how to get out of this position, but after Gus had stolen all of his money, he'd been left with little choice. So, Thursday afternoon, Mabel and Savon had picked him up after school, and now here he was, standing in front of the Timberlake house once again. Archer knew it was just his imagination, but he honestly felt like he could hear the buzzing of the bees in the cellar from his spot on the street. He steeled himself and headed up the walk to the front door. "Come in," said Mr. Timberlake, gruffly, within moments of Asher knocking on the door. Asher followed Mr. Timberlake into the house to the rear, where they found Tyler in the kitchen. He was standing on a step stool next to the sink. It appeared he was washing dishes. The boy had on oversized yellow rubber gloves, and bubbles mounded atop the sink, spilling over onto the counter. "That's enough, Tyler," said Mr. Timberlake, handing Tyler a towel. "You can finish those up later." The boy robotically took off the gloves, set them on the countertop, and took the towel from his dad. He wiped himself down and hung the towel over the oven handle to dry. Then he stood next to his dad and stared quietly at Archer. "I'll be in the yard again today," Wren Timberlake explained, giving his beard a thoughtful tug. "Why don't you and Tyler work on cleaning up the living room? Take the drop cloths off of the furniture, dust and sweep, and what have you." "No problem," said Archer. "Yes, Papa," monotoned Tyler. The last syllable stretched out into a hum similar to the one the boy had emitted 2 days before. Wren grunted and walked out the back door. Archer felt a strange tug in his stomach. Something was telling him to run as far and fast as he could from this house. The boy wasn't right. He was acting so strangely. Archer glanced over at the counter next to the kitchen sink. There sat 3 jars empty of honey, and one open with only a couple of spoonfuls left. How much honey was Mr. Timberlake feeding this kid? He knew the honey was supposed to calm him, but was it supposed to make him this machine-like? "Let's clean up," Archer said in resignation. "Where can we find the broom and dustpan?" Tyler led him to a closet near the front door. They spent the next 30 minutes doing as Mr. Timberlake had instructed. Tyler cleaned in a calm and steadfast manner. He was more thorough than Archer could imagine any 8-year-old to ever be. It was so odd. "Can you empty the dustpan, please? Now take the drop cloths to the clothes washer. Make sure to pick up the lamps and dust under them." Each request was executed perfectly and without argument or complaint. As he watched the boy run a cloth over the windowsills and scoop the dust and debris in one palm, which he then emptied over the garbage can in the kitchen, Archer began to wonder if the honey could truly be the culprit behind Tyler's flawless behavior. Perhaps the boy was simply mature for his age, or maybe there had been some discipline when Archer wasn't around that had made Tyler motivated to do as he was told. Archer decided to run an experiment to test his theory that the honey was the cause. First, he started asking Tyler to do things that were unrelated to cleaning the living room. "Tyler, please go up to the top of the stairs, then come back down." Tyler approached the staircase, scaled it, and returned. "Okay, now touch your toes 3 times." Tyler touched his toes thrice. "Go to the kitchen and get me a glass of water with 4 ice cubes in it." Tyler disappeared. Archer heard the clattering of the cabinet, fridge, and freezer doors opening and closing. When Tyler returned with a frosty glass, Archer counted the ice. 4 ice cubes. Archer continued to give orders while looking for the telltale signs the honey was wearing off. Fidgeting, babbling, running around. As soon as Tyler put the broom between his legs and pranced around like he was riding a horse, Archer knew it was time to shut things down. He cried out, "Stop!" But Tyler continued to play. He was about to knock the broom into an end table with an expensive-looking lamp when Archer offered, "How about some honey?" Tyler dropped the broom with a clang and ran to the kitchen. Grabbing the almost empty jar from the counter, Archer quickly administered a large glop of honey from the beehive-shaped dipper stick. Within a couple of minutes after Tyler gulped it down, he was calm once again. Archer leaned over, put his hands on his knees, and requested, "Please go pick up the broom and dustpan and put them away." The boy handed Archer the sticky dipper and walked off to do as he was told. Archer watched him pick up the broom and pan, take them back to the closet, then return for more instruction. It was confirmed. That honey wasn't just nutritious or calming. It was magical. It could make the person who ate it do whatever you asked them to do. Archer had an idea, but it was a dangerous one. If he had some of that honey, and if he could get Parker and Gus to eat it, he wouldn't need to pay them. He wouldn't need money at all. And he would never have to come back to this creepy house with the bees in the basement ever again. Tyler hummed quietly as he looked at Archer, waiting for another assignment. There wasn't enough honey left in the kitchen for what Archer had planned. The only way to get more honey was to go back downstairs. Maybe the bees aren't there anymore, he tried to reason with himself. Maybe Fernanda was right, and they were just hanging out until Mr. Timberlake was done with the smoker. Either way, he needed to give Tyler something to do. "Tyler, please go upstairs and sit on your bed and wait quietly until I come and get you. Okay?" Archer asked of the little boy. Tyler obediently went up the stairs and disappeared down the hall into his room. Archer went to the tiny door under the stairs. Maybe the bees are gone. The bees are probably gone. Archer grasped the cold metal knob in his hand and turned it slowly. As he opened the door, he heard the familiar, susurrant tone of bee wings flapping and saw the dim green glow of the magical honey. It would take all of his courage and more to go down there. Archer closed his eyes and told himself to do it, and do it fast. He wanted to run down the steps, skip as many as possible, grab a couple jars of honey, and bound back up the stairs. But Archer stopped himself. The bees had not disturbed him last time. If he made a commotion running around, might they take flight and sting him to death? He didn't want to take the chance. Archer crept down the staircase slowly on his tippy toes, trying to cause as little noise or movement in the steps as possible. He couldn't help but keep his eyes on the dark walls. The bees oscillated in unison, such that the wall looked like the pelt of a giant black bear. Archer imagined it hibernating, snoring, and one false move might wake it, cause it to pounce. He steadied his shaky breath as he walked past the bees to the shelves of glowing liquid. He didn't know exactly how much honey it would take to subdue Parker and Gus, but he figured 2 jars was probably enough. No, 3. Archer tenderly picked up the jars and cradled them in the crook of his arm. He hadn't brought a bag to the babysitting gig. He would have to take them outside and hide them by the front porch to grab on his way home. Otherwise, Mr. Timberlake might realize what was going on. Archer turned and slowly crept back up the stairs. At the top, he gently closed the door. The house was quiet. Archer assumed Tyler was still waiting upstairs in his room. As planned, Archer took the jars through the front door, descended the porch steps, and set the jars down under a bush next to the front walk. Then he scanned the area to make sure no one had been watching. The coast was clear. Not a bird song nor mosquito buzz disturbed the environment. Spite Lane was quiet. Dead quiet. 7. Luckily, the rest of Archer's babysitting gig went smoothly. Tyler behaved well for the remainder of their time, and Mr. Timberlake never noticed the hidden jars. He didn't even follow Archer to the door as Archer headed out. On the way home, when Mabel asked him what was up with the honey, Archer lied and said they were a gift from Tyler's dad. Mabel wasn't in a talkative mood, so the rest of the ride home was mostly quiet. Thank goodness, because the lies were beginning to pile up, and now Archer had to add stealing to his list of sins. He told himself it was all for a good cause. After all, he was doing this so he didn't have to lie on his homework. Could a lie told for a good reason cancel out a lie told for a bad one? Archer certainly hoped so. When he got home, Archer headed straight for the kitchen. "Graham," he called. "Graham, are you here?" Archer set the jars on the kitchen counter and went looking for his grandmother in the backyard. He found Dinette tending to her garden. "Hello, sweetheart," she called as soon as she saw him. She turned off the hose and wrapped Archer in a loving hug. "How is my special boy doing today?" As soon as she folded herself around him, Archer felt 4 years old again, a welcome break from the day's stresses. He burrowed into the soft, fluffy embrace of his grandmother's arms and relished the smell of her perfume, roses and baby powder. He rested his head and momentarily enjoyed the feeling of pure safety and comfort. But guilt is sneaky and determined. No sooner had Archer relaxed when a tendril of guilt snaked its way into his consciousness. "You lied to her," it hissed. "You lied, and if she finds out, she will never forgive you. You won't be her special boy ever again." Archer released his grasp. He stuffed the guilt deep inside where he wouldn't have to think about it. There was work to do. "Graham, can I ask you a favor?" Archer asked, his posture stiff. "Anything for you, Archer. I was hoping you could teach me to make honey bars." Dinette's face lit up brighter than afternoon sun hitting a placid lake. "I thought you'd never ask," she beamed. "Follow me." And she led Archer into the kitchen. Archer Abel looked conspicuous at school on Friday, carrying a clear Rubbermaid container with a red lid. A few kids assumed he was celebrating and wished him happy birthday in the halls, but it was famously hungry Mabel that lunged, trying to pry the container from Archer's hands the second he sat down for lunch at their regular table. "Hey, what gives?" Mabel pouted when Archer yanked the box away from her grasp. "Are those your grandma's famous honey bars?" Suki asked upon arrival, sitting down across from Archer with her lunch tray. "Yes, they are," Archer answered. "And they're for a class project." "Can't you spare just one?" Mabel cried, folding her lips into a desperate pout. Archer kicked himself for not realizing how much of an issue the honey bars might be at lunchtime. But he'd had no choice. He hadn't been sure how many bars it would take to accomplish his goal, so he'd brought the entire batch just in case. The container had been too large to fit in his backpack. Now it sat on the kitchen table in front of everyone, demanding attention. "I'm sorry," Archer said. "Like I said, it's for a project. I really can't spare any. Maybe next time." Mabel crossed her arms over her chest and scowled at him. "What project?" Archer scrambled to think of something. "They're for a chemistry unit in physical science." Another lie. "You know, elements, compounds, mixtures." Mabel looked unconvinced. But Fernanda, who had just walked up, flashed a rare grin at Archer as she found a seat. "Are you learning about thermal expansion?" Fernanda asked. "Bars are probably fine, but I prefer to use marshmallows as an observational unit." Fernanda to the rescue. Archer felt his racing heart calm a little. "Yep, that's it," Archer agreed, and he changed the subject. "So, what are we doing this weekend, fam? Anybody want to play Jackbox on Saturday night?" "I'm going with my mom to the Harvest Festival to read cards," Suki answered. "But if we get back early enough, Jackbox sounds fun. Which pack do you have?" The conversation moved on past the honey bars, but Archer could see out of the corner of his eye Mabel's suspicious stare. When the lunch bell rang, the four friends packed up their things, threw away their trash, and joined the crowd exiting the lunchroom. Mabel hung back and grabbed Archer, forcing him to join her. "What are you up to?" Mabel asked, nodding to the box of honey bars. Archer played dumb. "I don't know what you mean." "Be serious," Mabel insisted. "First you said you didn't want to go back and babysit on Spite Lane. Then you changed your mind without explanation. Then you take home a bunch of honey from their place. And now you show up to school with your grandmother's honey bars? This stinks. I don't know what you're up to, but you're acting super strange." "I'm acting strange. What about you?" Archer countered. "What about me?" Kids passed them left and right. Elbows and shoulders jabbed Archer in the back as they went by. Archer felt his temper grow short. "You're not telling me something. Something about Spite Lane," Archer accused. "You're not telling me something," Mabel shot back. Archer knew both of them were far too stubborn to back down, and he didn't have time to fight. "Fine. You're right. Something is going on, and I've been meaning to tell you, and I know you're not telling me something too. But we can't talk about it now. The bell is going to ring. We have to get to class." Mabel seemed to relax a little with his confession. Then let's agree to talk after school? Fine. And we're both going to tell the truth? Promise. Archer nodded again. Mabel seemed satisfied enough to walk away, but Archer's gut tied itself into a pretzel. He had no idea how, or even if he could tell Mabel the truth. Not with what he was about to do. Archer's last class of the day was history, but it was also the launching pad of his diabolical plan. Was he really going to tell Mabel about this? He didn't know. He just kept putting one step in front of the other, telling himself he would deal with Mabel and the consequences of his actions later. As Archer walked into the classroom, he saw Parker was already seated. Archer dropped a folded-up piece of paper into Parker's lap as he walked down the row of desks. Parker unfolded and read the note. It said, "Meet me by the gym after school." Parker turned and mouthed, "Okay." Archer felt a little relief. One down, one to go. When the final bell of the day rang, Archer scoured the hallways for Gus and found him right where he had expected, on his way to the gym to dress out for football practice. Archer tapped him on the back, and when Gus turned, asked if he could talk for a minute. Gus looked annoyed, but said, "Fine. What do you want?" Before Archer could make something up, they serendipitously ran into Parker. Hi, guys." Parker greeted them with a nervous look. What a surprise, running into you here." "The real question is, what are you doing here, nerd?" Gus said, bumping into Parker intimidatingly. With Gus and Parker distracted, Archer used the opportunity to take his plan to the next level. He faked a stumble, rolling one foot while dragging the other. As he fell forward, he tossed the plastic container of sweets into the air, and they went flying. Archer caught himself on the ground with a loud woof, and then, "Oh no, my honey bars!" Gus picked up Archer by the scruff of his collar, as though he were a limp puppy, and set him on his feet while Parker fetched the container of bars. Curious, Parker opened the lid. I think your stuff is okay," reported Parker, with a hungry look. "Whatever they are, they smell amazing." Gus didn't even bother to ask. He thrust a hand into the box and grabbed a bar. He sniffed it, shoved it into his mouth unceremoniously, and swallowed it, without chewing. "That was good," Gus said, going for another. Archer saw the look of envy on Parker's face. "Help yourself," he said. "Least I can do since you saved them." "I wouldn't say that," said Parker. But he grabbed a couple of bars anyway and began chowing down. "They're good, but they have a weird taste," said Gus, going for a third. "What is it?" "Honey," Archer said, licking his lips with anxious anticipation. "They're honey bars. My grandma's recipe." Everything was going far better than Archer ever could have imagined. He had been fretting over this moment all day, wondering how he would get Gus and Parker to eat the bars, worried he might have to beg them. But of course, they were teenage boys. They were impulsive, immature, and always starving. Archer should have guessed they would have a difficult time keeping their hands off the bars. He wouldn't have to beg or offer. If he kept standing there, the entire box would probably be empty in minutes. How long should I wait? He wondered, before attempting to see if the honey had taken effect. It turned out Archer didn't have to wait at all. Gus and Parker fell quiet and stood looking at Archer with absent expressions, their jaws revolving like a couple of cattle chewing cud. Archer seized the day. "So, listen, guys. I was thinking," Archer said in a quiet voice. "Maybe we could work something out about the history papers." Gus and Parker stared. "Like, maybe you could give me my wallet back?" Archer meekly asked Gus, but Gus didn't respond. At least he didn't punch me, Archer thought. He realized he might need to make it more of a command. "Give me back my wallet," Archer said with more determination. "After all, I don't even know why you took it from me in the first place." Gus let his backpack fall from his shoulder, grabbed it with a hand, unzipped it with the other, and pulled out Archer's wallet. He handed it to Archer without any trouble. "I don't even know why I took it," Gus said. Archer was shocked. He gathered his wits and checked the wallet to see what was left. $10. Better than zero. Thanks, Gus. You're a solid guy." Archer turned to Parker. "And Parker, maybe you could help us out in exchange for more of my grandma's famous bars." Parker didn't respond. "I mean, I want you to write our papers in exchange for more bars, not money." "I'll write your papers for more bars," Parker agreed. Archer's mouth fell open in surprise. It worked! Of course, Archer had no idea how long the effect would last. Based on what he'd observed at the Timberlake house, Tyler needed regular doses of honey fairly often to stay in line. What would happen when the honey wore off of these two? Would they remember what had happened? Would they be mad? "You won't change your minds later," Archer insisted. "Right. We won't change our minds," Parker and Gus said, in unison. Was it possible? Was Archer home free? He allowed a smile to spread across his lips. If it worked, he wouldn't need to babysit on Spite Lane ever again. But if it didn't work, he would need a steady supply of that magic honey. 8. Archer wandered off with an empty plastic container and a full, satisfied feeling in his soul. Parker and Gus had just eaten an entire jar's worth of honey and had become, before Archer had walked away, positively catatonic. He had told Gus to go to football practice and Parker to head home. But then what? Archer didn't know what would happen now. He rounded the corner to exit the school, his mind a blur of possibilities. When he bumped directly into Mabel, they both stumbled backwards. "Oh!" Archer cried in surprise, dropping the container for the second time that day. Without any contents, it was as lightweight as a tennis ball. It bounced down the linoleum hall past his friend. Mabel stabled herself with a stern look on her face. "What did you just do?" Archer avoided her gaze as he walked over and picked up the empty box. "I guess I dropped this. Oops." Mabel edged closer to him and whispered, "Archer, I saw you talking to Gus and Parker. I saw them eating the honey bars. I saw them, I don't know, acting weird." Archer marched to the doors of the school, Mabel on his heels, and waited until they were outside to respond. "I told you we could talk about it later." He still hadn't decided what he was going to say. Mabel leaned into his side. "Tell me what's going on now." Archer looked around. "Shh. Archer, I mean it. Tell me what's going on, or I'm going to tell your grandma you're using her honey bars for evil." He skidded to a halt and, eyes wide, turned to face Mabel. "Leave my grandma out of this." "Then tell me. You made those bars, didn't you? With the honey from Spite Lane?" Archer sighed and rubbed his temples. "Mabel, this is all just so complicated. Can we just walk in silence for a minute? I need to think." "Fine," Mabel grudgingly agreed. They began the journey back to his house without speaking. But it wasn't long before Mabel spoke up. "The honey really is haunted, isn't it?" She asked this in a voice that was quiet, almost reverent, not demanding, like she knew she was asking a loaded question. Still, Archer didn't want to answer. "I thought we agreed not to talk." "Archer, come on," Mabel said, insistent but not angry. "I've been to Spite Lane. I know how things work there." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I know nothing there is really what it seems. I know Spite Lane really is haunted." Archer stopped. "You lied to me." "Watch it, buddy. You're not exactly perfect either," she shot back as she continued walking. Archer jogged to catch up. "You knew about the bees. I don't know the specifics, but I've had my own share of strange experiences on Spite Lane." Mabel's chin fell as she opened up about her first babysitting visit. "My first job on Spite Lane, I watched a little girl named Twyla. Her mom told me not to go upstairs, but Twyla kept sneaking up there." "What was upstairs?" "A voice." "A voice? Whose voice?" "I don't know," Mabel said. "An evil entity? A demon? A poltergeist? Something was in her closet, calling to her. Some kind of paranormal force. It trapped Twyla and her whole family inside." "Trapped? Forever? Like they died?" Archer's voice was barely a whisper at the horrifying thought. "I don't know," Mabel said, more defensively this time. "But if they died, don't you think it would have made the news or something? Wouldn't everyone know? A whole family dying or disappearing, especially a kid? Something like that would be a big deal, wouldn't it?" Archer walked slowly, dragging his feet as he considered. "I mean, you would think so. But this is Spite Lane we're talking about. Most people just ignore it entirely." "Yeah." They reached the end of the walk in front of Archer's house and stopped. "Mabel, why on earth would you go back there after something like that happened?" Archer asked, with a compassion that surprised even Mabel. Her posture slumped. "What if they're not dead? What if they're just in, like, another dimension or something?" Mabel asked. "Twyla was just a little kid, and her mom seemed nice. What if there was some way I could find them and bring them back?" "I had to go back to investigate." "That can't be the only reason you went back," Archer argued. She blushed. "Okay, fine. That's not the only reason I went back. I also needed the money." "What for?" "Well, for one thing, I owe Fernanda for those tickets to Torture Town." "Oh, girl, don't worry about that. Fernanda will be fine. She's got a whole savings account." Mabel chewed on her lower lip and tugged at a lock of long, black hair. Also, my mom is in trouble. Oh, Archer said quietly. Mabel's friends all knew her other secret. Mabel's mother had a shoplifting problem. Did she get caught again? She didn't pay rent, is what happened. Mabel sighed, with a shake of her head. I'm trying to help Sivan keep us from getting evicted. Jeez, girl. I had no idea. Of course you didn't, because I haven't told anyone. She gave Archer a preemptive punch in the shoulder. And you can't say anything either. Got it? Archer mimed as though he zipped up his lips, locked them, and threw away the key. But Mabel, this still doesn't explain why you sent me to go babysit there. Mabel shrugged. After what happened to Twyla, it all seemed like a dream, you know? I can't tell you how many times I thought to myself it couldn't have happened, that I must be crazy. But if you went and something supernatural happened, well then, it wouldn't just be me, would it? Now it's your turn. Spill the beans. You made those honey bars with the honey from Spite Lane and gave them to Gus and Parker. Why? What's so special about that honey? Archer rolled his eyes and took a seat on the front stoop of his grandparents' house. Well, I'd say you're not going to believe this, but after your story, I don't think that will be a problem. And with that, he told her everything. He explained how he couldn't stomach writing the revisionist history papers, so he had been paying Parker to do it for him. But he'd run out of birthday money, so he'd taken the job on Spite Lane. Then Gus had stolen his earnings, so he'd had to go back for another gig even though the cellar was full of buzzing bees. But the thing is, the honey has some kind of magical property that makes people do whatever you tell them to do. I thought it would be better to use the honey to talk some sense into Gus and Parker, rather than have to go back to Spite Lane and keep paying for my essays. Talk some sense? Archer, get real. What happens when the effect of the honey wears off? I don't know for sure. Tyler starts to get more energy and follow directions less, but that's different than, I don't know, changing someone's mind about something, right? Like, maybe when it wears off of Gus and Parker, they will still agree that the bars are a better payment than money. I mean, I guess it's possible, but it seems really unlikely, Mabel argued. I gave them a lot of honey, Archer said, cringing a little. Like, a lot. Jeez, Archer, what if you hurt them? I don't think there are any negative effects. How do you know? Well, I don't know for sure, but Tyler seems fine. Oh, geez, Mabel said, covering her face with her hands. I don't know. Maybe we should tell someone, like an adult or something. Archer felt the tingle of guilt tickling inside his guts again. He hated this feeling. If I can prove to you the honey is safe, he offered, then will you help me keep my secret? How are you going to do that? It was Friday, and Archer and Mabel weren't scheduled to babysit on Spite Lane until the following Tuesday. Archer suggested they make a special trip over the weekend to visit the Timberlakes and make sure they were okay. Mabel thought about it for a second and then agreed. Fine. I'll see if I can get Sivan to drive us over there tomorrow. Great, Archer said. Thanks, Mabel. And thanks for keeping my secret. They stood and hugged. As Mabel headed off to walk to her own house, Archer watched her go. He was so relieved to have told someone what was going on. So why didn't he feel any better? 9. Mabel asked Siobhan to drop her and Archer off at a comic book shop while he was at work on Saturday afternoon. Mabel explained to Archer the shop was within walking distance of Spite Lane. Once Siobhan was out of eyesight, they could walk the rest of the way. Siobhan dropped them at Pine Haven Comics a little before 3 p.m. They watched him drive away, waited a few extra minutes for good measure, then headed out. A cold front had moved in overnight, obscuring the sky with puffy gray clouds that rolled over Lost Key like a quilted blanket. Archer and Mabel hadn't prepared for the weather. They walked along the shoulder of Blue Angel Parkway, rubbing their arms to keep warm as they were pelted with icy drops of rain that fell intermittently through the trees. Under the canopy of pines on Spite Lane, they noted a temperature shift. The air stilled, the rain disappeared, and the air thickened with humid heat. As they crossed the threshold of broken gates and emerged into the clearing, they couldn't help but notice that Spite Lane was sunny and warm. Archer had never felt so unsettled by a beautiful day. How is this possible? Mabel wondered. It was raining 2 seconds ago. I think it's better if we don't ask, Archer answered, forging ahead. Let's just do what we came for and get out of here. The plan he'd devised called for nothing more than a white lie. He would knock on the Timberlake's front door, tell Mr. Timberlake that he thought he might have left behind a special pen in Tyler's room on Thursday, and they would be invited inside. Tyler would pretend to look for the pen and not find it, and then they would leave, having proven that Tyler and his dad were just fine. Yeah, but what if they're not fine? Mabel had argued. They will be, Archer had countered, and there was nothing more to say. They just had to be fine. They climbed the steps of the front porch and landed in front of the Timberlake's front door. But to their surprise, it stood partly open. The house inside was quiet and dark. Archer didn't know what to do. He looked to Mabel, who put up her hands in confusion and shrugged. Archer knocked on the door, and it swung open even wider. Archer poked his head inside. "Hello?" he called out into the musty darkness. There was no response. "Should we just go inside?" Mabel asked in a hushed tone. "I'm not sure," Archer answered. It was too bright outside and too dim inside for him to see anything. "Why don't we try around back first? Mr. Timberlake might be outside tending the hives." They hopped down the steps and circled the property. The Timberlake yard was overgrown. Its grass grew high and spindly. It tickled their knees as they waded through it to the rear of the house. Various insects flew by, buzzing their ears, as they stumbled into the backyard. "He's not here," Mabel stated, unsurprised. "Yeah." Archer chewed on the inside of his cheek. He rotated on his heels to scan the neighborhood. The sunny sky, the empty house. Not a soul in sight. It was a beautiful Saturday. At least, it was beautiful here on Spite Lane. Why weren't there children outside playing? Where were the adults that should have been mowing their lawns and painting their porches? None of this was fine. "Now can we go inside?" Mabel asked, with an impatient tug on Archer's shirt sleeve. "Sure," he said aloud, although alarm bells were blaring internally, telling him to run. Get out of here as fast as he could and never come back. Archer and Mabel went back to the front door, where they took one last peek before pushing the door open the rest of the way and stepping inside. Mabel softly closed the door behind them. "Hello?" Archer called. "Mr. Timberlake? Tyler?" As usual, the curtains were all closed. A tiny slit in one set allowed a sliver of sunlight to slice through the darkness. Tiny particles of dust danced in the beam. "This place is weird," Mabel said. "The furniture looks ancient. No TV? No radio? You swear someone actually lives here?" Archer didn't answer. He walked ahead towards the kitchen. Entering it, he found it was empty of people. But on the counter, a bevy of glass jars sat in neat rows next to the sink. Empty. Archer quickly counted them. 24 jars in all. Had the Timberlakes really gone through 24 jars of honey since he'd been here 2 days ago? The father must have been eating them too. No way the little kid ate 12 jars of honey a day since Archer had babysat. "Should we check upstairs?" Mabel asked. Archer nodded and took her back to the staircase. He scaled them 2 by 2 and went straight for Tyler's room. There were 2 empty jars knocked over on the floor next to his bed, but no child in sight. Down the hall, Archer found what he presumed to be the father's bedroom. Mr. Timberlake was not inside. The bed was unkempt, covers strewn, and on the bedside table sat 4 empty jars under a glowing lamp, drips of sticky honey visible, glinting in the light. Archer's suspicion was confirmed. Both father and son had been consuming the honey. But why? They wandered back downstairs. Archer outstretched his hand, was mere centimeters from grasping the front door to leave, when Mabel took a turn and went to the far side of the staircase. "Archer!" she called, in a half-whisper. Archer's gut twisted. He knew exactly where she was. He found her standing in front of the tiny door under the stairs. The door stood open. From below came the telltale hum. "Is this where you saw—" "Yes." "We have to go down there," Mabel insisted. "We have to check." "Do we, though? Archer?" "Ugh. Fine." Archer took the lead. "Mr. Timberlake?" he called down from the first step. "Tyler?" No answer. The next 2 steps creaked loudly as Archer descended. They creaked again as Mabel added her weight. Archer didn't know what he should hope for, that they should find the father and son downstairs or find the cellar empty. Nothing but honey and bees. What they found dashed any hope that things were fine. In the iridescent green glow of the remaining jars, most of which sat open and half-consumed on the floor, Mr. Timberlake hunched over, his back turned, Tyler at his side. They breathed strangely, in short, resonant gasps. Between ragged breaths, they made sucking noises, squeaked and slurped. Archer and Mabel glanced at one another in confusion. Archer swallowed, gathering his courage, and softly said, "Mr. Timberlake?" The man and his boy flinched, whipping their heads around to look back at the teens over their shoulders. Mabel screamed. Their faces were covered in tufted, golden hair. Their eyes were large, black orbs that reflected the glowing jars many times over. Honey dripped down their chins from gaping mouths that no longer had teeth, but instead twitching black mandibles. They were using their hands to shove the honey down their furry throats, but they weren't really hands. Their skin had turned black and crusty, and their fingers had grown long and spindly with more knuckles than any human would have. Timmy and his dad had turned into monstrous human-bee hybrids. Mr. Timberlake unfolded, standing to an even greater height than Archer remembered. He buzz-growled, and the room shook. The jars clanged, creating feedback as they vibrated against one another. In response, the bees that covered the walls intensified their flapping. Archer realized they weren't welcome visitors. They had intruded on the Timberlake hive, and it was clear the Timberlakes would defend their territory. "We have to go," Archer said, shoving Mabel back up the stairs. "Go! Go!" Mabel ran, and Archer followed. Archer didn't look back. He didn't want to know if they were being followed. He just wanted out. At the top of the stairs, he slammed the door shut and pushed Mabel towards the front door. They ran through it without closing it behind them, soared off the porch without touching the steps, and sprinted back towards Spite Lane's front gates. "What were those?" Mabel yelled as they ran. "I don't know," Archer responded. "And I don't want to know. Let's just get out of here." As they reached the edge of the pines, they scooted over to the side of the road, barely missing being run over by a car that was headed into the neighborhood. Archer witnessed the woman driving and saw the magnet on the side of her car. "Pleasant Stay Realty," it read. "Molly Maplethorpe, Realtor." "Move to Lost Key," read the tagline. "You'll never want to leave." Her face looked like the one Archer had seen on the sold sign in the Timberlake's front yard. Why would anyone want to move here? He thought. As far as Archer was concerned, he would never return to Spite Lane ever again. 10. Back at the coffee shop, Archer and Mabel agreed to call the police and submit an anonymous tip. Then they walked to the corner of the shopping complex and waited. A few minutes later, a police cruiser pulled onto the shoulder just outside the entrance of Spite Lane. The car sat idle for a bit, its blinker flashing on and off. But when it finally began to roll forward, it was to pull away, back out into traffic, not enter the neighborhood. "What's it doing?" Mabel asked, with indignant disbelief. Archer shook his head cynically. "I knew it. They wouldn't go in there, not even if there's a true emergency." They retreated back into the coffee shop where they agreed not to tell anyone else what had happened until they had time to think about it. Archer spent the rest of the weekend fretting. He'd fed that same haunted honey to Parker and Gus. What if, at this very moment, they were turning into monster bees? He wasn't sure if he would ever forgive himself. On Monday, Archer kept his eyes peeled in the halls, looking for any sign of Parker and Gus. If they had already turned into monsters, would they bother to come to school? Archer expected at any moment the school to erupt into screaming, kids running everywhere as Parker and Gus buzzed through the halls, mandibles chomping. Thankfully, nothing like that happened. Instead, it was confirmed that Gus was out sick in Archer's second period class. Another student, a friend of Gus's, said it was probably the flu. Archer clenched his teeth and tried not to burst into guilty tears. When the lunch bell rang, Archer walked a long lap around the cafeteria, snaking through the tables looking for Parker. Archer found him sitting with a couple of chess club kids. "Hey, Parker," Archer said, trying to sound casual even though he never went out of his way to say hello to Parker at lunch. Parker looked up at Archer with tired eyes. Archer was struck by how dark the boy's irises were. Parker was a redhead with pale skin and bright freckles. Had his eyes always been this black? Archer thought they might have been blue, but he couldn't remember for sure. He'd never made note of Parker's eye color. Had never needed to. "Hi," Parker said, with a scratchy yet resonant voice. The tone lingered, a guttural hum. Archer attempted small talk. "How you doing?" Parker's friends looked up at Archer with raised eyebrows. They knew something was up, even if Parker was oblivious. "I'm good," Parker said unconvincingly. "How are you?" "Good," Archer said. "Just thought I'd stop by and—" He watched Parker's hand reach up to scratch the back of his neck. "Say hi?" Archer gulped. Parker's neck was covered in a soft, short fuzz of yellow and black hair. It looked exactly like the fur that covered the Timberlake's faces. Archer took a step back, then another, his eyes still glued to Parker's neck. "Hey, watch it!" called a classmate, as Archer ran into her and knocked a carton of milk from her lunch tray. "Archer, are you—" Parker held out a hand, but Archer recoiled further after seeing Parker's fingernails had turned thick and black. "Sorry, I... Archer stammered as he lumbered off. He landed in a daze at the table he usually sat at with his friends, toppling onto the bench seat next to Mabel. His breath came in shallow pants. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" asked Mabel, patting Archer on the back as though he were choking. "Parker," Archer gasped, trying not to hyperventilate. "Slow down," Mabel insisted. "Look at my eyes. Take a deep breath." "What happened?" Archer took a second to calm himself, then said, "Gus is out sick. And Parker, his neck, he has that fur on his neck." "Oh no," Mabel murmured. "Fur?" Suki stopped unwrapping her dessert, which she always ate first. "Shh!" Archer and Mabel both scolded. "What's going on, you guys?" Fernanda demanded with a frown. Archer knew he'd have to spill the beans. Mabel shrugged, as if to grant him permission. "It's the honey," Archer admitted. "It's magical, but not in a good way." "I knew it," Suki exclaimed with a self-satisfied smile. "Don't get so excited," Mabel said. "It turns people into monsters." "Ooh." Suki gingerly bit down on her bedazzled fingernails. "That's not good. No, it's not good," Archer said in a harsh whisper. "Because I fed some to Parker Rush and Gus Rumson." "Why on earth would you do that?" Fernanda asked, shaking her head. "I didn't know it would turn them into monsters," Archer hissed. "I thought it just made people more suggestible." "What were you trying to get them to do?" Archer looked at Mabel again, this time for help. "They were bullying Archer," Mabel lied. "He was using the honey to get them to stop." Fernanda and Suki appeared to believe this version of the story, but this didn't make Archer feel any better. At this point, he thought he should carry a notebook dedicated to keeping track of all the lies. They were piling up, and Archer didn't know how he was going to eventually dig himself out. Suki leaned back in her seat and looked around the cafeteria. She spotted Parker and squinted at him. "So, wait, you're saying the honey turned Parker into a monster? Because he looks okay to me." "I guess I only fed him enough to have a small effect," Archer said. "But I think if I kept feeding him the honey, he would eventually turn into one of those things like—" He stopped. "Like?" Suki asked, eyes wide and imploring. Archer slumped over in his seat. "Like Mr. Timberlake and his son, Tyler. Whoa! You mean you turned that kid you were babysitting into a monster too? Suki gasped. No, Archer insisted, although he certainly felt to blame. I mean, it wasn't my fault. That was Mr. Timberlake. I don't think he wanted to turn anyone into a monster. I think the honey is just, like, cursed or something. Suki began to twirl one of her pink and black braids in her hands, thinking. Well, is there any way you can, I don't know, reverse the effects? That was a good question. Archer looked at Fernanda, their human search engine. Maybe, she said with a shrug. It depends on what effect the honey is having on them. What do you mean? Some medication has short-term side effects, like the way the cough medicine might make you sleepy, or steroids might give you bigger muscles. But if you stop taking the medicine, the side effects will wear off over time. So, what you're saying is that if they stop eating the honey, they might go back to normal? Archer felt more hope than he'd felt in days. That's great. There wasn't much honey left when we saw them. Most of the jars were empty. If they finished them that day, they might have already started reverting back to their old selves by now. Fernanda was at the ready to dash his hopes. Maybe. Unless the honey is more like medication that has a permanent effect. Like how some antibiotics cause long-term damage to tendons or the nervous system. Jeez, Fernanda, how do you know all this stuff? Mabel remarked, as she noisily unzipped her lunch. I remember the things I read, Fernanda said, with a nonchalant grin. But, Fernanda, the honey isn't medication, it's like magic or whatever. How will we know if the effect is permanent or temporary? Observation. Archer waved his hands between them like he was swatting away a nest of angry wasps. No, 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 no. I'm not going back there. I'll go. Suki hopped in her seat, beaming. No, Archer insisted. No one is going back there. That place is dangerous. Sort of, Mabel said, out of the side of her mouth. It definitely is. Archer pointed his finger at her. Mabel, we were both there. We both saw them. You saw how big Mr. Timberlake was. He could have crushed us. But he didn't, Mabel said, as she took a large bite of food from her tiffin and spoke around it. I'm not saying you have to go back to that house. No one is going to force you to go back if you don't want to. But someone should check on that little kid. Archer frowned. Mabel hadn't told everyone else about Twyla, but Archer knew what Mabel was talking about. This was the second kid to fall victim to Spite Lane's trickery. Mabel felt responsible. Frankly, Archer did as well. But he was terrified of returning. There had to be some other way. As if she'd read his thoughts, Fernanda said, Look, someone has to go back to that house if you're going to find out what happened to the bee people. I'll go, Suki repeated to incessant groans from her friends. Come on. This is right up my alley. Maybe I can talk some sense into them, find out what they want. Maybe I can even help them turn back into people. Mabel opened another container and pulled out a folded-up piece of naan. Suki, what makes you think they would want to talk to you and not eat you? Suki turned over her crystal necklace in her hands. You know, people really misjudge the paranormal. Most of the time, spirits just need help resolving something that didn't get resolved when they were alive. like my mother always says. They're restless, not mean. Mabel reached forward and tapped the table in front of Suki to emphasize her point. This isn't most of the time. This is Spite Lane. Suki gave Mabel a precocious look. Why don't I go with you and find out? Archer sighed. If anyone is going back to the Timberlake house, it's me. And if Tyler and his dad aren't back to normal? Mabel asked, her eyes glistening with skepticism. I don't know. But I can tell you one thing. If there's any honey left, it has to be destroyed. I can't live with myself, knowing that stuff is out in the world and could hurt more people. Mabel huffed. The bees can always make more. Then the bees have to be destroyed too. Oh, really, tough guy? And how are you going to do that? Archer's mouth hung open. He didn't have an answer. I have an idea, Fernanda said. You do? Archer sighed with relief. You need to get Tyler and his dad away from the honey, and you need to make sure there's none left. So, why don't you just do what Mr. Timberlake does? What's that? Mabel asked. Fernanda smiled. Smoke them out. 11. Are you sure you don't need my help? Mabel asked, standing next to Archer at the edge of the Timberlake property later that afternoon. They stared up at the brown house as though it might turn into a bee monster too. Archer shook his head. I'm good. You have some unfinished business of your own. Yeah, Mabel sighed. I sure do. She turned and looked down the street at the red house with the yellow front door. Twyla's house. Mabel had told Archer she needed to go back to investigate and, hopefully, find a way to bring Twyla and her family back to the land of the living. How are you going to get inside? Archer asked. I'm hoping the key is still hidden in a box on the front porch, Mabel said. And if it isn't? Mabel shrugged. I'll figure something out. Then she punched Archer lightly on the bicep. Good luck, champ. And Mabel walked away. Archer was left on his own to try to execute Fernanda's plan. It had sounded a lot easier when they had all been sitting around the lunch table daydreaming. He steeled himself, took one step after another, and made it to the front door. It was closed, but a soft turn of the knob revealed it to be unlocked. Archer gently pushed the door open. He listened for the sound of buzzing, flapping, stomping, or growling. He didn't hear a thing. The house was quiet. He bravely took a step inside. First things first, he needed plenty of escape routes for the bees. One by one, he opened all of the curtains, unlatched the locks, and cracked open all of the windows. He started out slowly, carefully taking soft steps, but as he went, he hastened. Eventually, he was running from room to room, bounding up the stairs to the second story, then scurrying back to the first level. He felt like a thief, trying to grab as much as he could before fleeing from the police. But to anyone who might be looking, he was just a kid letting in fresh air and sunshine. He left the front door standing partway open, then went through the kitchen to the back door. He left that door open too, clambered down the back steps, and approached a shed structure attached to the back of the house. Next, he needed to prep the smoker. A padlock had been looped through the shed latch, but it hadn't been fastened, so Archer was able to easily unhook it. He tossed it on the dusty ground. The doors to the shed creaked open. As light streamed in, Archer saw there was a small work table covered in everything he needed. A pair of yellow work gloves, a metal pail full of pine needles and dried grass clippings, a butane torch, and the steel smoker with a bellow that reminded Archer of his grandfather's accordion. Fernanda had explained how to light the smoker, but Archer had watched a couple of videos online just to be sure. He hoped it was as easy as the videos had made it seem. The smoker looked a little like a stainless steel coffee pot with a pointy nozzle at the top. The nozzle was attached with a hinge. Archer folded it back and looked inside the chamber. Fernanda had told him to be sure to take out any old ashes, since they might prevent a new fire. But when Archer removed the breather plate, there was nothing inside. Mr. Timberlake had cleaned it out after its last use. Archer stuffed a handful of the pine needles and grass clippings inside and used the butane torch to try to light them. He stuck the torch deep inside, turned it on, and watched the dry kindling instantly combust. Archer pressed the bellow on the side to push air into the bottom of the chamber. The oxygen fueled the flames, and they grew. Archer repeated the process, stuffing more kindling into the chamber and using the bellows to blow on the fire, until there was a steady stream of sweet-smelling smoke. Then he folded the nozzle back on its hinge. He pressed the bellow again. Smoke puffed out of the nozzle into a thin column. The smoker was ready. Now, he had to put on some protection. On the inside of one of the shed doors was a hook that held something long and white. Mr. Timberlake's beekeeping jumpsuit. It was one piece with long sleeves and long pants that had elastic at the wrists and ankles. Gloves and booties were attached with snaps. Archer unzipped the suit and climbed inside. Mr. Timberlake was a very tall man, much larger than Archer, and the suit reflected their size difference. Archer swam in the thing. It would be awkward to move around, he realized, but it was a necessary safety precaution. On a hook on the inside of the other door was the hood, with the dark mesh veil to protect his head and neck. It was far too large for Archer's head and made it difficult to see, but again, Archer didn't have a choice. He had to wear the thing, or risk getting stung on the face, or even end up with bees in his nose or ears. The mere thought of it scared him into submission. No quick movements of his head, he decided, or the thing might slide over his eyes or off his head entirely. He would have to work carefully. Time to go back inside and destroy the evil honey. Archer awkwardly picked up the smoker with a gloved hand and shuffled up the back porch steps into the house. A lovely cross breeze and streaming sunshine made the house seem less scary and emphasized how strangely Archer was acting. But Archer knew that the basement would not be so cheery. He needed to get in, do his business, and get out. He went straight for the tiny door under the stairs. Standing on the top step, Archer listened. The humming noise was so strong, it vibrated the step under his feet. Archer pushed the bellow on the smoker and watched the smoke fill the air. It slowly descended into the basement. But then, Archer realized that would only send the bees flying right at him, as the only escape route was behind him through the door. Like it or not, he needed to walk to the far side of the basement and smoke them out from there. Archer waited for the smoke to dissipate, then slid his feet down step by step. No sign of the Timberlakes, and there were only 2 jars of honey left on the shelves, surrounded by a sea of empty ones. Archer made this his primary focus. He crossed the packed dirt floor and picked up one of the jars. The glove was so awkward, he dropped the jar. It smashed on the ground below. It was what Archer had wanted, regardless. Archer used his gloved hand to slide the other jar to the edge of the shelf and let it fall naturally. It, too, burst, the green, glowing honey spreading out into a slowly growing puddle. Oddly, the floor soaked up the honey. That part of the mission was now accomplished. But the hardest part was yet to come. Archer needed to get rid of the bees. And then he needed to find Tyler and his dad and smoke them out too. A small window on the far side of the cellar beyond the stairs looked out into the side yard. The door to the staircase was open, but Archer didn't want to leave any exit closed. He began walking towards the window, intent to unlatch it before smoking the bees out, when he froze, in mortified fear. Under the stairs were two large, hulking figures with giant black orbs for eyes and golden fur covering them, head to toe. Very little of them was still human, save for their form. Arms and legs with compound joints moved them forward as their large, jagged mandibles clacked and pinched at the air. Could it be? Was that Tyler and his dad? As they emerged into the dim light from the window, nothing about them was recognizable. If he had not witnessed the transformation himself, Archer would never have guessed these creatures had ever been human. Their faces were gone. Their bodies were lumpy, and their skin was rough and leathery. Their fingers and toes had lengthened, sprouted teeth-like formations, and their mandibles dripped a gooey substance. Archer didn't believe it was possible they would ever go back to normal. Terrified, Archer knew he had to run, but the human bees were clearly faster and more powerful than he was. Archer punched the bellow, pointing the nozzle at the monsters, coating them in a thick plume of smoke. Their buzzing turned into a shriek, the sound of a violin being scraped laterally by its bow. Archer fell backwards as he tried to get away, and the smoker went flying. As it clattered to the floor, the lid popped open, and the fuel tumbled out. The lit embers landed on a pile of collapsed cardboard boxes and old newspaper that immediately caught on fire. The room began to fill with smoke and fire. The bees that had covered the walls became agitated, flew from their resting places, and buzzed around the room, pelting Archer on all sides. Instinctively, Archer put up an arm to cover his eyes, but then remembered he didn't need to. He was wearing the protective veil. Still, between the smoke and the bees, Archer could hardly see. Rolling onto all fours, he did his best to scamper to the stairs. The oversized outfit made it difficult, but he made it. He began bear crawling up the stairs, one by one, until he felt something tug on his foot. Looking backwards caused the helmet to slide down over one eye, but he caught a glimpse of the problem. One of the monsters had his ankle in its mandible. Archer wailed as he wagged his foot back and forth. He kicked the monster in the maw, and it let go. Archer climbed the rest of the stairs like a ladder as bees whizzed past him, anxious to get away from the burning cellar. Archer tripped and stumbled through the thickening swarm on his way through the kitchen. He felt and heard heavy thuds behind him as he went, as the monster slammed into the walls and ceiling, following him through the house. Archer launched himself out the back door, somersaulted down the steps, and landed in a heap on the ground. He rolled over and over again through the yard, trying to distance himself from the house. Smoke and bees poured from the windows. Behind him, the monsters were trapped, stuck in the doorway, too large to both fly through at once. Their mandibles angrily chomped at the air as they tried to push themselves out. Archer lifted himself up onto his knees, then onto his feet. He yanked the veil from his head, pulled the gloves off of his hands, hastily unzipped the suit, and fell backwards, trying to take it off. He landed on something warm and lumpy. He yelped. "Archer, it's me," Mabel cried. She helped him get the rest of the suit off and dragged him further out into the grass. From their spot in the yard, they watched the monsters burst through the doorway. Splinters of wood exploded onto the lawn. Flames lapped at the air as soon as the creatures were free. The entire first floor was ablaze. The monsters headed straight for Archer and Mabel, and Archer thought for sure they were goners when, just as the creatures were about to land on top of them, enormous wings unfolded from their backs, and they took flight, soaring up into the sky and out over the pines, where they could no longer be seen. "Let's go!" Mabel yelled. They ran into the street, but Archer stopped to take one last look. The fire crackled within, heat rising until the windows exploded and the roof went up in flames. Archer scanned the area. Where were the neighbors? Why wasn't anyone coming to their rescue, or even just to see what was going on? There was only one other person out in the open. Just down the street, her car parked in front of the red house with the yellow door, stood Molly Mapplethorpe with a "for sale" sign in her hands. She seemed unperturbed by the fire. She was scowling directly at Archer. Archer was utterly confounded. "Hey, isn't that Twyla's house?" "We have to get out of here," Mabel insisted. She grabbed Archer by the wrist and yanked. As the teens ran off, Molly Mapplethorpe walked up the lawn and jabbed the "for sale" sign into the dead grass in front of 123 Spite Lane. When she looked up, the teenagers were gone. The Timberlake house continued to burn. 12. A week later, Mabel stood off to the side in a patch of grass adjacent to the bus circle, waiting for Archer after school. Only after Parker Rush had walked away did Archer join his friend. "Well, how did it go?" Mabel asked, pointing her chin at the stapled packet of papers in Archer's hands. Archer huffed a sigh. "The good news is that no lasting physical damage seems to have been done to either Parker or Gus," he said. "That's good. But I don't know about their mental state." Archer handed the papers to Mabel. After scanning the essay, her mouth dropped open in surprise. "What is this?" Archer scratched his temple. "It's not an acceptable history essay, that's for sure." The paper was inscrutable. It seemed to start off okay, but by the third paragraph, Parker had started to write the word "buzz" over and over, and the fourth paragraph was a sea of endless Z's. "Is he going to be okay?" Mabel asked, handing the paper back to Archer. "The fur on the back of his neck is gone, and his eyes are blue. I can only hope that means his brain will go back to normal soon, too." Mabel and Archer began to trudge slowly off campus towards home. The November air was crisp, and although Lost Key was too far south to enjoy a traditional fall, some of the leaves had finally turned golden brown and softly rained down from the trees. "What do you think that means for the Timberlakes?" Mabel asked. "Do you think they might go back to being human, wherever they are?" Archer chewed it over in his mind. "I hope so, but I don't know. It's a nice thought, though. Maybe they got far enough away from the haunted honey to heal." Mabel hummed in agreement, which made Archer elbow her in the side. "What are you going to do about your essays?" "Guess I have to write them myself," Archer answered. "Are you going to do it the way she wants, or are you going to tell the truth?" Archer shook his head wearily. "If I tell the truth, I'll fail the class. And if I fail the class, it will break my grandmother's heart." He frowned at Mabel. You don't want me to murder my grandma, do you? Maybe she could talk to the teacher or the principal or something. Honey, don't be so naive, Archer said. This time Mabel elbowed Archer back. Archer, you have to tell her. You know it's the right thing to do. Archer didn't answer. At the edge of his neighborhood, they parted ways, and Archer went home to face Dinette alone. As soon as he walked in the door, he smelled the familiar aroma of her honey bars. His heart formed a lump in his throat. Hey, my sweet boy, Dinette called, as Archer walked into the kitchen with his backpack over his shoulder. She pulled out a chair for him to sit in and set a plate with 3 honey bars on the table in front of him. Archer set the backpack in his lap. It was now or never. Grandma, he said, in a voice shaking with trepidation. There's something I need to tell you. He unzipped the backpack and reached inside. He fondled the edges of Parker's paper. Dinette took a seat across from him. What is it, baby doll? Archer's wide brown eyes found hers. She looked at him with so much love and acceptance, he found himself unable to speak. Dinette grew concerned. Archer, what is it? You know you can tell me anything. Archer looked down at the edge of the paper. He started to tug it, but didn't pull it out. I've been meaning to tell you, but I didn't want you to get upset. Go on. Archer bit his lip, chickening out at the last second. He zipped the backpack without pulling out the essay. I don't really like honey bars as much as I used to, he said, cringing in fear. I'm so sorry. Dinette burst into a deep, hearty laugh. Oh, sweet boy. Is that all? You don't have to worry about a thing. I know tastes can change. Dinette hopped up and gave him a huge squeeze. What do you like? I'll make that instead. She went to the shelf where her cookbooks were stored. She pulled a hardback off the shelf and flipped it open. Double chocolate brownies, red velvet cupcakes. She rattled off one dessert after another. Archer was ashamed of himself for not telling her what he really meant to say. He lied and told her 7-Up cake sounded good. Then he excused himself to go to the bathroom, where he scrubbed his hands as though he could wash the guilt away. Then he ducked into his bedroom. In Archer's closet, hidden on a shelf under a stack of folded socks, sat 2 jars of golden green honey. The ones left over after making honey bars for Gus and Parker. They glowed, green and dim, in the dark of his closet. He stared at them with a conflicted heart. He didn't know why he had kept them or what he would do with them in the future. But for some reason, it had seemed wrong to throw them away. For now, he figured they were safe as long as no one but him knew they were there. Archer put the socks back on top of the jars and turned to leave his room when his laptop, which sat open on his desk, chirped once, then twice. He walked over and moved the mouse back and forth, waking it up. It chirped again as a notification popped up in the top right-hand corner of the screen. Archer? He frowned. It was a Discord message from Suki. He opened Discord and read her previous messages. Archer, are you there? I need your help. Come to Spite Lane right away. Archer? What was Suki doing on Spite Lane? Since he and Mabel had last visited, they'd agreed as a group that it was too dangerous to ever go back. Horrified, he replied, Suki? Are you okay? What's going on? He waited, but there was no reply. Archer had never wanted to go back to Spite Lane, but now he had no choice. Suki was in trouble, and she needed Archer's help. The real question was why she'd gone there in the first place. There was only one way to find out. This concludes The Beekeeper's Son, written by Christiane Erwin, narrated by Jenn Lee. For exclusive updates about the Spite Lane Hauntings series and more, join the Lost Key Book Club by visiting www.christianeerwin.com. Please note, no actual children, living or deceased, were harmed in the making of this audiobook. The views expressed in this book do not necessarily reflect the points of view of the disgruntled spirits that haunt Lost Key. All people, places, events, and things mentioned in the book were products of the author's own infallible imagination or were conjured by the ghosts that whisper stories in the author's ear while she sleeps. This has been a production of Lost Key Literary, LLC. All rights reserved. Copyright 2023. No part of this recording may be used without express permission. For licensing inquiries, please contact info@lostkeyliterary.com.